Hi guys, Drew from Aloha Plant Life here, and today I am going to be taking you step by step from start to finish through two of the easiest ways for you to propagate a philodendron, such as my philodendron micans here, which I will be using as an example for you, as well as my philodendron cordatum, which is hanging in my bathroom. But before we get into what exactly those two processes are and how to do them, first of all, we need to talk about when and why you might want to propagate a philodendron. So as for the why, maybe you just want to propagate a plant. Lots of people just like to propagate plants, and that's totally a valid reason. But maybe it's because your plant is getting a little bit long, a little bit leggy, it's looking lanky, and you really want to get it back to a bushier look. That's one reason that a lot of people trim back their philodendrons, and when we're trimming back, it's the perfect time to propagate because we're having to cut growth off anyway. Now, in the case of my micans here, you can see that it has one extra long vine compared to the rest of the vines. And part of the reason I want to do this is because this long vine is actually starting to trail and almost reach the back of my couch. And I don't want it trailing across the couch. The other reason I'm okay with going ahead and trimming this one back is it is just so much longer than the rest. I would like them to kind of grow in more full together, so I can accomplish that by taking this one back a bit. Another thing when we're thinking about the whys for propagating, perhaps you have a plant that's more mature than this, because as you can see, this mican, by the way, absolutely love the philodendron micans. It's got this velvety texture to its leaves, just it's one of my favorite philodendrons. But as you can see, this one's relatively young and it's very full on top still. But if you have a more mature philodendron and it hasn't been getting much light up top where you have it, lots of times you'll see it start to look a little bit bald. And so people will want to make it bushier on top again. Well, you can do that by taking cuttings and propagations from the bottom of your plant and then replanting them up in the top to make it fuller. So sometimes that's why people want to propagate. Now, as far as when to propagate, if this was still a very small baby plant that didn't have any crazy long vines, if it was just this growth up here on the top, I would not propagate it yet. It really needs time to mature more, to get more growth on it before I go and propagate it. And if you ever take too much of a plant off, especially when it's young like that, you're risking the life and the health of the plant. You don't want to prune it back too much. Now, the other part of when to propagate has to do with what time of year to propagate. If I'm being honest, you can propagate year-round, you guys, but I will tell you, for whatever reason, in my experience at least, the propagations that I take in the winter do not root nearly as fast as the propagations that I take in the spring and the summer. So now that you know the why you might want to propagate it and when you would want to propagate it, let's talk about the two methods that you can use to propagate your philodendrons. One, you can water propagate them. Two, you can propagate them directly into soil. I'm going to go ahead and talk you guys through the water propagations first, because I think it's honestly the easiest method. It's my preferred method. I just think there's a higher success rate with the water propagation method, and I'll explain why as we go along. So if this is your first time propagating one of your philodendrons, I would highly recommend doing this water method that we're going to go through first. So the first thing you need to take into consideration is where you're going to cut on your plant, how many cuttings you're going to take. And one thing that I think a lot of beginners don't realize is that if you only take one cutting off of your philodendron or any vining plant for that matter and propagate it, and then eventually, even if you do it in water and you move it to soil or you do it direct to soil, it doesn't matter. It's only ever going to grow as like one vine. So in order to have a nice full plant like we have here, you need multiple cuttings to get this look. So you got to keep that in mind. You want to be able to have multiple cuttings. So if you don't have a vine long enough to get at least 3 cuttings out of, I would wait a little bit longer before you do it. But once you get to this point, I've definitely got enough here. So I already looked at this when it was on my couch earlier, not on my couch, on the shelf above my couch earlier, and kind of looked where I might want to cut and counted how many nodes it was going to be, and it's going to be about 6 nodes. So that's going to be a good amount for what I want to do today. So where do we make our cuts? That's the next big question. So I'm sure you guys have heard people say, make the cuts below the nodes. Has anybody ever been left wondering, okay, if you say cut below a node on a upright plant, where's the below on a vining plant? So this is a hanging plant. So you might be wondering, does she mean cut here or above that node? I don't know, because now it's hanging. It's not an upright plant. I don't know. I don't understand. Okay, let me let you in on a little secret, you guys. It really doesn't matter. You'll see as we go along that it really doesn't matter. So I've got where I want to cut on here. So I'm going to be cutting in between these 2 nodes. So these are my nodes here. where the leaves are growing out, and I've got this nice big space in between here. I'm going to cut right in the middle of that space so that I can separate this end piece of this vine. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors, my snips, and I'm going to cut at a 45-degree angle. And there it is, it's done. All right, so let me set this plant aside. Now, one thing you do want to do on the what is now your mother plant, right? Because we're going to be making our babies out of our cuttings. You see, I've got this long bit of stem still here, and I want to cut that closer to the next leaf that's right here, right? I just don't want this stem just hanging out. So I'm going to cut it to where there's only about 1/4 of an inch of this stem remaining. Once again, I'm just going to make a nice clean 45-degree angle cut. And then that little bit of stem is just going to get thrown away. So now I've got my vine. We're going to cut these all into their own individual propagations. And what that means is we're going to cut them into individual nodes. So as I mentioned, you can see there is your node right there where the leaf is connected. So I'm basically just going to cut evenly between each node like I did a second ago. So I'll cut in the middle here, I'll cut in the middle here, I'll cut in the middle here, so on and so forth, all at a 45-degree angle. You guys, I do want to point out the last section here where you can see there's a leaf starting to come out here. I've got a node here. This node, no problem, we can propagate that. This node might not be developed enough to grow roots, but we've already cut it off, so we might as well try. However, if you think it's definitely not developed enough to grow roots, you can leave this node here and just put this node into your water for it to root. Your choice though. I'm probably going to leave it attached today because this leaf really has not started to unfurl much at all. So now you're probably going to notice on some of your, well, unless your plant was growing very symmetrically in between each node, you're probably going to notice now that we've cut those in half, you're going to have some of them that have really short stems on each side of that node like this, and then you're probably going to have some that have bigger, longer stems on each side like this. The ones like this, we want to trim them down so that's only about no more than 1 inch on each side of that node. Once again, just making those 45-degree angle cuts. So ideally, this is what we want all of our nodes to look like. And once you've got all of those done, you're just going to throw away those extra stems, and we are going to move on to the next phase of the process. Now, I do want to make one note here. A lot of people leave their cuttings out to dry so that the ends aren't moist where you just cut, because a lot of people worry about rot. I'm just going to be straight up honest with you guys. I have never done that. I do let my succulent cuttings, for sure, if you're doing any kind of succulent propagation, you're going to want to let those callus over completely because those will rot very easily, but that's just because they're holding so much moisture in their leaves already. I do not let any of my other cuttings dry out and callus over, and I have honestly never had a problem. But if you want to do it, do it. Couple hours, that's all you got to do. But right now I'm just going to move forward to straight up moving these into water. So I've got a few shot glasses here because that's what I had that didn't already have propagations in them, with just some room temperature water in them. And basically all you're going to do is you're just going to put them into that glass and you're just going to let them drape over the edge. And you can put more than one cutting in each glass. They don't each have to have their own glass. But you also want to be mindful not to put too many in a glass depending on how big your glass is, because as they start to root, you don't want them to get all kind of tangled up together. So for this little shot glass, I'm probably only going to put 2. But you want to make sure that that node is completely underwater, and you want to make sure that the leaf is not in the water because you don't want that leaf to potentially rot and cause a problem. So I've got another shot glass over here. Once again, I'm just going to keep adding these until they're all in water. And then for your water propagations, you guys, you're going to want to make sure that you're changing out that water at least once a week. If I'm being totally honest with you, sometimes I don't think I remember it's been a week, so it might be once every 2 weeks, but I do look at them whenever I am going around checking on my plants, and if the water looks like murky or like stuff's floating around in it, then I'm definitely going to be changing out that water. And you want to make sure when you're changing out your water that if anything has gotten funky on the actual stems of the plant, like if you see some cloudy stuff clinging to it, make sure you run it under the water and gently rub that off because you don't want anything potentially causing issue with the roots to develop. And then as far as where you're gonna place these propagations, sometimes I put mine directly in a north-facing window just because I feel like it's a little bit less harsh. I don't have to worry about if they're getting hit with direct sun rays or anything like that. But really you just want to make sure that they're not getting a lot of direct light on there. You want it to be indirect light. Now, as far as how long they're going to stay in the water, once again, it kind of depends. I'm going to set this over here aside. It kind of depends on what time of year it is. If it's spring or summer, your roots, in my experience, are going to grow and develop much more quickly. Anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks is what I would say. And in the winter, I think it's taken up to 6 weeks on ones that I've tried to do in the winter before. So don't get concerned once again if it's taking longer during the winter. Now, I didn't mention this before, but rooting hormone, because I'm sure some of you have a question about rooting hormone. Do you use rooting hormone? I do not use rooting hormone in the water propagations for sure. You can, if you want to, use it in the soil propagations. I don't see the need to. These plants root pretty easily just in general in soil. So, you know, if you want to try it, but I don't think it's an absolute necessity. So let's say your cuttings have now been sitting in water for 2 to 4 weeks and you're seeing roots. When do you take it to the next step, which is to now transplant that plant from the water into soil? So I have some cuttings that I took about 3 weeks ago from my cordatum. So I do have roots on these, and typically what you're going to want to see is at least 1 to 2 inches of root growth before you transplant these into soil. And you do want to make sure that you're not leaving them in water for too long, because philodendron can grow in water on a regular basis. So you could leave these in water permanently if you wanted to. But since that's not what we want to do for today's purposes, we want to make sure that once they get about as long as this one's got going on here, I don't know if you can see that root there, it's almost 2 inches long. That's around the level you want it to be before you start putting it into soil. Now this one only has this one single root, so I'm actually going to leave this one in water a little bit longer until I see at least another root starting to develop. This other one over here actually does already have 2 that are 2 inches long, and it's starting to get a third, as you can see there. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put this one into soil today. I'm going to let this one just hang out for another week or so until I see a little bit more root growth there. So when you are ready to move it to soil, you're going to take it out. You're going to want to go rinse this under the faucet and make sure it's nice and clean. There's nothing weird on there from your water. I'm going to do that real quick. So now that I've got this rinsed off, I'm going to grab my tray. I'm going to grab one of my little 3-inch pots, and we are going to pot this up in the soil. So I'm going to take my soil and I'm just going to make sure that about at least a quarter of the bottom of that pot is covered with soil. And now that I've got that in there, I'm just going to set this in there gently, making sure it is centered in the pot. And then I'm just going to backfill in that dirt around it. Now, before I go too far into this, you guys, I do want to let you know that you can actually pot multiple of these up together. So if this other one had been ready with its roots, I would have put both of them into this little 3-inch pot. Because it is a 3-inch pot, I would not do more than 2 at a time in a pot. And could you do, because I said earlier, you need a lot of cuttings in a pot to get a nice full bushy plant, right? That's what I said. Could you actually put all of these together at the same time, right when you take them out of water, into a 6-inch pot? Theoretically, yes. The reason I don't do it that way, and I really won't recommend for you to do it that way if you're a beginner especially, is that you're setting yourself up for a greater chance of rot happening, because you're gonna have so much soil and you just have this much little tiny roots. And typically in that situation, it's really more difficult to get the soil wetness correct on a regular basis while they're rooting without having that root rot situation happen. I'm gonna go ahead and start filling this back in while I'm explaining all this to you. So that's why I don't recommend it. What I do is I put them, like I said, in these smaller pots. And then once they've had time to establish their roots more and they become almost root bound, then take all of those 3-inch pots, all of those 4-inch pots, and take them out and replant them together in a 6-inch pot. Because now you've got much more established root structure, a bigger root structure, especially once you combine them all together, that is better suited for the amount of soil that you're gonna have in a 6-inch pot. So that is highly what I recommend you guys do. So once I've got this all potted up in here and enough soil in, so once you've got that done, you're gonna want to run this under the water just enough to get it wet, like barely have something start to drip through the drainage holes. So I'm gonna take this over to the sink and do that real quick. Okay, so now I've run some water through it. I got another smaller tray to put it on so it can keep draining, let all that water drain out. And then this next step, not absolutely necessary. You could leave it like this, things will be fine, but I find that I have better results if I cover them with something such as a plastic Ziploc bag to help trap in more humidity. So all you're gonna do is you're just gonna take a bag, like I said, Ziploc or other, just make sure it's transparent. And the nice thing about this is you can also write, and I would recommend doing that, write the date on here that you potted it up so you can keep track of how long it's been, how it's doing. And you're just gonna cover it with that bag. Try to make sure the leaf isn't like sticking to the bag or anything weird like that. So it's just gonna be covered like that. And now I'm gonna set it in a bright, indirect, sunny location. Mine right now, where I've been doing them, is in my kitchen. I have a glass door that's east facing. It's facing me this way. And then next to it is an angled window that is southeast facing. So I have these on a cart that is about 3 feet back from that window, and it's worked perfectly for me. Now, you do want to keep an eye on these because you want the soil to stay moist, but you don't want it to be wet all the time. And you definitely, when it's trying to still root, don't want to let it dry out all the way or anything like that. And you also want to keep an eye to make sure that if moisture is building up in this bag, make sure that it's not building up so much that you're getting mold, like signs of gray mold growing on the plant. If you are, cut the corners of the bag off. I find that helps to aerate it a little bit more, or you could just uncover it for, you know, a couple hours or a day or whatever it needs to be to help it kind of dry out a little bit. But basically, that's all you're gonna do. And then in a few more weeks, say 2 to 4 weeks, you're gonna start to see new growth. And this is what that is gonna look like. So I just uncovered this one from its plastic covering on it about a week ago. It originally started in water and then I moved it into this pot. And originally I did, like I said, have it covered, and it has just taken off. There were only 2 leaves on this one when I potted it. So these 2 leaves right here were the only ones that were on here. Not when I, well, yes, when I potted it, but when I put it into water, there were 2 leaves on there. And you can see all of this new growth that has taken off here. And you can also see, this is how I kind of knew it was time to take the bag off. You see these roots that were trying to grow like straight up out the side up here, roots here. All those roots were trying to grow, and I was like, okay, maybe it's a little too humid in that bag now. So I uncovered it, and it is still growing and still putting out a ton of new growth, but this plant I know is successfully rooting now. So at this point, when I start seeing all this growth, I'm not gonna keep the soil as wet as long. I'm gonna let it dry out a little bit more, but still not all the way or anything like that. No more than probably half. And I'll always be looking for signs that it needs water up top as well, as usual. But yeah, so this is taken off. But as you can see, this would only be one single vine ever if I didn't pot it up later into a larger pot with more cuttings, which is what I'm gonna do. I've got this one, I've got another one over there that's already been put into soil, and now I'm gonna take these ones that we're doing today and everything, and I'm gonna move those all into a pot together once the roots have had time to really establish. So that is the water method, start to finish. Now let me talk you through the straight to soil method. Set this plant back in its spot. Okay, so I went ahead and took a vine cutting because I still had one super long vine that I was wanting to trim off of my Philodendron cordatum, which is living in my bathroom as I mentioned, and you can see different look on this philodendron, these bigger green leaves that are kind of glossy, and you can see probably here how much thicker stemmed this is compared to what the micans was. So much, much thicker, but the same concepts apply here for both of these plants. And so I'm gonna go ahead and once again, I'm gonna cut this down into its individual nodes just like we did before. Okay, so I've got that done, and if you look at the end on this one, it actually has 2 new leaves starting there. And so this node right here is actually probably a lot more viable on this one to be able to cut it off and have it be its own thing and it to potentially root, but I'm still just not gonna risk it. I'm just gonna leave this one like this. Okay, so I've got them all cut into their individual nodes here. And now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna take our pot again, and we're gonna do basically the same thing we did when we were transferring the other one from water to soil. We're just gonna put some soil into that pot. So once I've got enough soil in here, I am just going to go ahead and stick one of these directly in there and backfill around it again, just like before. So you can see, I'm just gonna stick it down in there in the center of the pot and then just add more soil around it. Now for these ones, you guys, I am not gonna put more than 1 in a pot. The reason I'm not gonna put more than 1 in a pot is because if one of the cuttings happens to get rot, and I will explain the things that could cause that in a second, then it's potentially gonna spread to every other cutting in that pot. And that's going to decrease my success rate for the cuttings. So when I'm going straight to soil, I like to keep them separate. A lot of people put them all together and just accept if some of them rot, but I just figure why not set myself up for a higher rate of success from the get-go. To each their own. So now I've got it in here, and the same thing, I'm gonna wet this down just enough to where it barely starts to drip through the drainage holes, So let me go do that real quick. Okay, so I've got it in there, and once again, I like to cover them with a plastic bag to create that extra humidity, but you don't necessarily have to do that here if you don't want to, but I really do think it kind of helps. So once again, you're just going to take that bag, place it over the top. Now, when you're going direct to soil like this, I think the potential for rot is much, much higher. And there's multiple reasons for that. One, if it gets too much heat. So if it's too close to that window, or if it's just getting too much sun activity on it that it's heating up the space in that bag, that can cause a rot problem or a mold problem. Two, if it gets too wet, that can cause a problem once again with mold and or rot. So really what you're trying to do here, because this one doesn't have roots. The one we did before already had roots, right? So it's already got a better start in soil than this guy who has no roots. So you're gonna wanna keep that soil moist, but not wet. So that will encourage the root growth to start to happen. And once the roots have started to establish more, just like on the other one, you can back off that watering some. But what happens a lot when you're going straight to soil is you end up keeping it too wet, and then that leads to that rot problem. And especially if you get it too hot and too bright of light, if it's not getting enough air circulation. So in this situation, I actually would cut off these corners just like this. Since we're going straight to soil and I am more worried about that potential for rot, I'm just going to take these corners off so that now I've got a little bit of ventilation going on there. So it's still going to trap moisture in there, but these vents are going to help aerate it a little bit more, if that makes sense. So now that guy is good to go. And so basically I'm just going to do the same thing with all of these other cuttings and nodes that we took. But that's basically all there is to it, you guys. Like I said, 2 very easy processes for propagating philodendron. If you have any questions on anything I've covered today, please comment below and let me know, or you can DM me on Instagram or on Facebook at Aloha Plant Life. And if you've not yet hit that like and or subscribe button down below, please do so. And I look forward to seeing you guys again next time. Aloha!